Uh, Good evening, everyone, and happy Hanukkah, and welcome to this celebration of Jewish radicalism. And I'll start by saying a huge thanks to Red Labour for initiating this event and hosting it this evening. I'm Julia Bard. I'm chairing this event this evening. I'm an active member of the Labour Party in Islington North, and we have a wonderful independent MP here. I'm one of the founding editors of Jewish Socialist magazine, and I'm very much looking forward to this evening. We've got a great lineup of speakers and performers. I'll start with a few housekeeping rules. I'm sure most of you know the routine. Please keep yourself muted so that we can all hear the speakers and performers. This event will be a mixture of words and music, and towards the end there'll be a panel discussion. We encourage you to respond to the speakers and performers, and because there are so many people on this call, we're asking you to post your questions in the chat, and we'll do our best to include a wide range of perspectives. We expect contributions to be respectful, and I want to reassure everyone here that we will remove anyone who uses hate speech or tries to disrupt or undermine the event in any way. It's wonderful and also politically significant that this event was sold out almost as soon as it went public. And we've had to live stream it so that more people can participate. It's great to see so many people who want to explore, to learn about and share the rich tradition of radical Jewish activism that radical Jews themselves have had to reclaim and reassert. I grew up in a Jewish home in the heart of the Jewish community. But strangely, the Jewish history I learnt stopped around 70 AD with the destruction of the Second Temple and started again in the 1940s. The gulf between the two was sparsely populated by rabbis giving us some pretty good aphorisms. Love your neighbour as yourself. If I am not for myself, who will be for me? But if I am just for myself, what am I? And if not now, when? To sustain us through centuries of persecution, punctuated by the occasional golden age. That was the version that we had. I learnt nothing about the 1,000 years of Jewish life in Europe, the millennia of Jewish life in the region that was Babylon, now Iraq, the 2,000 years of Jewish life in India, and Jewish life among other minorities and nations in so many other places. This minorityness, this diaspora life, a people living across borders, is normal for us, and we have resources and traditions to sustain us through good times and bad. Tonight is the 6th night of Hanukkah, the Jewish festival of lights and enlightenment. It commemorates a determined struggle by the ordinary members of a community to protect themselves and their way of life from pressure to assimilate, to disappear into the culture of their Greek colonizers. Needless to say, Jews from the far right to the far left, like the ancient rabbis, argue about the significance of this story, and they all claim it as validating their perspectives. For radical Jews, this diversity and discussion, the rows and the arguments, the teasing out of ideas, are our precious heritage. But it's a heritage we're having to fight hard for, because forces within and beyond our own community are becoming increasingly draconian in trying to police the boundaries of our debate and to limit our ways of expressing ourselves culturally, politically, and socially. We will not concede to those attempts to stifle and suppress our ideas, our needs, and our concerns. And this event symbolises our determination to discover, discuss, share, and above all, enjoy our great tradition of Jewish radicalism. And we're going to do all those things this evening. We're delighted and privileged to be able to kick off the event with the great comedian, writer, actor and commentator Alexei Sayle. He's familiar to all of us in many mad and wonderful guises from his long career in stand-up, television, film, theatre, radio and in print. And tonight he will reflect, among other things, on how his communist background and his Jewish relatives have influenced his politics. The floor's yours, Alexei.
Hi, Julia. I sort of thought it was going to be an interview, isn't it? You were going to say, like, tell me about your Jewish heritage. Am I just supposed to talk uninterrupted, like on a kind of Hebrew just a minute for about Judaism for how long am I on for? Well,
Yeah.
you're going to ask me questions at some point. You know.
I can do it if you want me to. Go on.
Well, yeah, I'll run out of stuff to say after a while. So I thought that was the format, but I mean it's fine. Obviously, I can talking with words. My job is. All right. Yeah. Well, so my mother, Molka Mendelssohn, was Jewish. She met my father, Joe Sale, who wasn't, at some sort of socialist event in 1947. And I think that, I mean, her background was that she was one of seven children. I think she had seven sisters and then I think she was her father's favorite. She was ferociously bright, and I think her father was it was a very devout household. Her father, studied the sacred texts with her. But I suspect when her brother Monty was born quite late, that her father shifted his attention to her son, really. And so anyway, she, for whatever reason, she became radicalized, left wing. And then when she met my dad, obviously they were married in 1950. I don't know when they were. They were married, and that caused, because he wasn't Jewish, that caused a great disruption. But I always felt that my mother, that she'd in a sense swapped one religion for another, from Judaism to communism, and so we grew up in so we in a sense we grew up with two religions. I mean, to a degree, she was reconciled with her family, and we would go and we would go around to they lived in the kind of Jewish neighborhood of Liverpool. We would go and visit them, and it was a bit like, I always think it was a bit like visiting a kind of an alien kind of embassy, really. This very austere household, really, with these very empty, apart from various bronze objects. They would come to visit us, and then and I always felt, I suppose, I always felt Jewish. I always knew I was Jewish, and I was always, I was always very happy. I always loved the idea of being Jewish, I think. And I had one incident from when I was at grammar school that I was always late. And I remember going in, climbing over the wall or something when I was in the fourth or fifth year, and suddenly seeing all these kids in a classroom well after assembly had started, kind of lounging around, playing records, listening, reading magazines and stuff, and saying to my mother, mention it to and I said to somebody in the school, who are those kids, after I'd been punished for my lateness. I said, who are those kids? And they said, oh, they're the Jews. They don't have to go to, they can come in whenever they want, really, and they don't have to go to Christian assembly. So I went home in a fury to my mother and said, why didn't you include me? Why didn't you tell the school? And she said, I didn't want you to feel left out. We come, you send me to school in clothes you made, and she was a tailoress, but she was a very bad one. I'm encouraged to spout Marxist theory in geography lessons, and you don't want me to stand out. Thanks for that. And also, my mother would constantly, in the kind of tradition of Jewish radicalism, she would always, if there was any, the staff were terrified of her, really, because she was one of those. It was unusual then. I think it was unusual then. The parents in schools were very accepting of what the staff said, but that didn't wash with Molka. She would be straight down, to the school if there was any infringement on her beloved Alexi's academic career. So yeah, she didn't want me to stand out, and yet I had all these various black marks against me. But yeah, I was always, I always loved the idea of being Jewish. Really, I mean, obviously we didn't we weren't religious in any way. We didn't. My wife Linda always says I'm a pagan, really, because I've been brought up in no religion at all. So I'm completely unaware. And certainly the first time, it's a digression, but the first time I went to a wedding, there was a friend of mine. It was a church wedding, and a friend of mine was actually married by the Bishop of Exeter. And I said to Linda, "Who's that bloke dressed as a chess piece?" So all religion was anathema to us, and was was strange, seemed strange religion. Well, yeah, I mean, culturally, the household, dominated by my mother, felt tremendously Jewish. And then later on, I always graduated. My best friend, who sadly died a couple of years ago, was Jewish. I was always very drawn to Jews. I always felt like there was some connection, really. And then our other parallel religion was of course communism, which in a sense is a Jewish invention. I think I know that Marx's father actually converted to Christianity, but he certainly had the disputatiousness of a rabbi, and so that was our other religion, really, was communism. And I used to make that joke about, we had that in my stand-up about, we had a photograph of Stalin above the mantelpiece scoring the winning goal for Liverpool in 1939 Cup final. It was one of the best retouching jobs the KGB ever did. So yeah, communism, Judaism, and yet she didn't want me to stand out. There was another example. This we did feel as kind of cultists. We did on my first day in primary school. I think the teacher, Miss Wilson, said, "All right, class, let's put our hands together and thank God for the milk." And I said, put my hand up, and I said, "No, Miss Wilson, I think you'll find that the milk is provided by the Milk Marketing Board, which is a semi-autonomous organization of the government, which is used to buy up the milk and then force up the prices that are charged to the workers." And as a tribute to the radicalism of Liverpool schools, even in the 50s, that I wasn't beaten up on the spot. So that's me, communism, Judaism.
Can I ask you about your wider family, your mother's family? How did they?
Well, yeah, I think they, I think we did have a kind of uneasy relationship with them, although perhaps they were grateful in a way that communists had taken Molly off their hands. They said, "Whoa, thank God, we've got rid of her." She was the most, I know, she was very well known and well loved amongst the the left community in Liverpool. And towards the end of her life, they would have meetings of Palestinian solidarity campaign in the place called the Casablanca, which is a club owned by a collective of dockers in Liverpool. And they would carry Molly in a wheelchair up the stairs. They had no disabled access, but they would carry Molly up the stairs to the PSC meetings in a wheelchair. But yeah, we had the relationship with her family was strange, really. I think because she'd married out, so it was never really completely resolved. I think. And then one of her sisters actually moved to Manchester and married an Orthodox Jew, and I always think that I see some of those. In fact, when I go to Manchester, you always see somebody. You always see an Orthodox Jew, and I think, well, one of these must be my cousin. I don't know how they would feel about that, but So,
Can I ask you about that other supposed pillar of Jewish identity, Israel, and your views on Israel-Palestine, and where that politics came from? I mean, you said that your parents organised in support of Palestinian justice.
Yeah, I mean, my I think I can't remember in a way where my connection with Palestine came from, apart from that it always seemed like an obvious injustice. It always seemed like the most, and the way, we're through the looking glass on that now, but it always seemed like a tremendous wrong, really. And so I was drawn to that. And I was also, when I was still at school, I became friendly with a number of Palestinians. I always found them, one of my best friends, Wasim, who now lives in Ramallah. I just always found them tremendously attractive, as people, really. Just the vitality and I mean, I don't know whether that's, that is connected in a sense with their oppression, but I just always loved to be amongst Palestinians, and they always seemed the most, the most marvelous people, really. And I lived with Wasim in my first year in London, I mean, and then I think I was pretty much a founder member of MAP. I think. I mean, I don't know how people can't see. When you go to like a Palestinian meeting, pro-Palestinian, and there's always like one Zionist, and I don't know whether they're sent along or sometimes they come on their own account, and then they'll make a speech at some point everybody else is unhappy with. But I always think, how can you listen to this stuff? How is your mind so closed that you can listen to what you're hearing in this meeting and not be moved? How can you hang on to your ideology, your brutal ideology? How can you retain affection for this? How can you advocate for this country that does these terrible things when you've listened to these stories of suffering, from Palestinians, and you've listened to all this solidarity from fellow Jews? I don't know how you can remain unmoved. And I'm not on the other side. I understand to a degree. I understand why Jewish people, it's caused me a lot of solaces. My best friend, was not particularly as Jews age. They develop this affection for Israel, and it was a great problem between us, really, and to a degree it affected our friendship in later years, and I feel very regretful. But I understand what the fears and the social conditioning that made him, want to forged his feelings for Israel. But what I can't understand how they cannot see our point of view as well. That the suffering and the cruelty. It amazes me that people can close their hearts like that.
Do you think that that's got more difficult? And do you think there's any way of building a bridge?
Oh no, it's fine now. You can say what you like about Palestine. Really, it's a positive career boon to support Palestine. Yeah, it's obviously we are living in a time. I know. I grew up in a kind of I started working as a professional comedian in the late 70s, and it was a time when it was when left-wing voices were fated and you could say what you wanted. Really, it was and I perhaps I got complacent because of that. And now we're living in a time, I think, when it is dangerous to speak out, particularly on Palestine, that there are all these malevolent organizations looking to make you pay, looking to silence you. And it's an extraordinary time, I think, that we're living through. It's I mean, in some ways it seems I seem to be one of the only ones who speaking out. It's great for my demographic. I've got 200, I've got tremendous following from all those people who are not hearing. And it's not a balanced view, not hearing our side of the story. It's not that we're right about everything, but the socialist side of the story is not being told. Our voices are being suppressed, I think, and and Palestinian voices, yeah, being suppressed as well. And there was a terrific film on Channel 4 News last night about it. But generally speaking, you know, our side of the story, you know, and that's the history of the 5 years of Corbyn, has been expunged, distorted, we're lied about constantly. And I never thought I would live through such a time, you know. It's awful.
Yeah, and that's why we're holding this event this evening, to give a platform and a voice to that radical Jewish
Yeah,
tradition.
because it's not, you know, it's. I mean, the suppression, you know, is just breathtaking, I think. And I don't know. Again, it's that other thing about how can all these journalists either tell these lies, or I always think that's why they drink so much. It used to be in my day, that's why they were all drunk, because it was corroded with guilt. I think they probably, I don't know what they do now. They do Peloton or something to expunge their guilt. But I just think, how can you tell these lies? You know, but yeah, they live in a kind of self-confirming world. Is my feeling about journalists in a way. And Corbyn, to a degree, punctured that. You know, and they hated him for it. Really.
Yeah, and people like you puncture it as well. I'm going to draw this conversation to a close, because it's been really great to listen to you. And you've given us a lot of food for thought as well. And I think it's really important for people to think about those interpersonal relationships and how we're going to move on from here and change hearts and minds and bridge the massive gap that's
Yeah,
opening.
I think, yeah. I mean, you have. I mean, I never knew. You know, I never knew. It's a tremendous sadness how Israel kind of came between me and Harry, really. And I feel like I could have handled it better, really. I'd like to go back in time and kind of fix it, really, without, you know, just talk more. I think that's all you can do, is talk in a kind of human way to your friends, you know, your friends who have these, you know, these feelings for Israel. You know, you gotta try and talk them out of it.
Thank you very much for your contribution. It's been really beautiful to talk to you about all of this, and we really appreciate it. And I know that I will be speaking for this huge audience that we've got here today, in thanking you for.
Well, thank you for the opportunity. Yeah,
And
how much is this?
yeah,
Okay,
I
I'll
hope
put
you
myself
enjoy the rest of the event.
on.
And now I'm going to welcome Barnaby Rain. Barnaby's a historian at Columbia University in New York. He's an activist and a brilliant analyst and a commentator on Marxism, anti-Semitism, the politics of the Labour Party, and much more beyond that. You may, like me, have been cheering the telly recently when he just continued to speak the truth on Newsnight loudly, despite Kirsty Walk rudely shouting at him and over him on Newsnight recently. He and I first met when he was trying to organise a lot of rather independent-minded groups into a Jewish bloc on the huge demo for Gaza in 2014. This evening, Barnaby's taking the long view. I'm not sure exactly what he's going to be saying, but I know that, as always, he will shine a light into unexpected corners of Jewish radical ideas. So over to you, Barnaby.
Thank you, Julia. Can everyone hear me? Thank you so much to Julia and to everyone for being here. I'm going to begin somewhere that will be familiar to you, Julia, and I'm sure to many at this event. Isaac Deutscher begins his classic essay, Message of the Non-Jewish Jew, with a story from the Talmud. It's the story of a heretic who gave lessons to a very great rabbi. On Shabbos, they would meet and talk, and then the heretic would ride out beyond the ritual boundary while his students stayed put within the bounds of the community. This is, I think, a powerful image for many of us gathered here tonight. Like the heretic, we feel half in and half out, tangled up with our Jewishness and yet rootless in most Jewish worlds, seen as unfathomable or suspect. Some Jewish socialists, I think, feel that in their exclusion, they're the Jews of the Jews, in every synagogue a stranger in a strange land. That is how Jewish conservatives sometimes see us too. But an absence in Deutsch's essay always struck me. A materialist to his core, he reads Jewish radicalism as a product of the ghetto and the anti-Semite, universalism and struggle as the boldest and most beautiful of many reactions to the circumstances faced by many Jews. I think there is another aspect to the story too. I think there are hidden gems and jewels in the Jewish religious tradition that have long nourished and sustained radical thoughts. Judaism announced from the start that no human being could ever really be king of the universe, and every single human being is the image of God on earth. One medieval Jewish theologian responded to Christianity by saying, if God really could have a son, then we are all those sons. Every homeless man who shivers on city streets tonight, every mother everywhere who worries about having enough to feed her kids, every child whose sleep is punctuated by bombs in Syria or in Gaza, these are all like crystals, each person a shard of the divine. And that view cannot possibly sanction this world we inhabit, a world of iniquity, where some people pretend to be kings and so many people are not free. How did Moses come to feel himself a Jew? He was raised a prince, but he saw a man beating a slave and he didn't turn the other cheek. With his bare hands, he killed and buried the slave driver. Later, when Moses led the slaves out of Egypt, it was not only Jews who fled. The book of Exodus tells us that many among the poor and subjugated of Egypt joined Moses and fled Pharaoh. At every Seder service, we ought to remember that. On those first 2 nights of Passover, Jewish families read memories of enslavement, and then we read the words, "Do not mistreat a stranger, since we were once strangers too." These are the seeds of something called solidarity. As a small child, the Passover Haggadah, I always think, was my first political lesson. There's something quite distinctive in all this. It's that strange mix of particularism and universalism that puzzles some and invites the scorn of others. You Jews think you're the chosen people, a kind of master race, say the anti-Semites. What does chosenness mean? It happened twice. First with Abraham, who chose God, and then that great Klekbah, when liberated slaves chose not a set of privileges, but a set of obligations to the world. 613 commandments when non-Jews must obey only 7. Judaism's the only religion I know whose heaven is likely populated mostly by others from outside the fold. Why all those extra tough obligations? Some Hasidim say that in every generation a potential Messiah is born, who might smash tyrannies and usher in the propertyless egalitarianism prophesied by Isaiah. It's my bar mitzvah haftorah re'eh, that's why I remember it. It's the mission of a chosen people in a broken world to help make that happen. I don't often agree with Rabbi Jonathan Sacks, but he was surely right to say all of this is, quote, the polar opposite of the idea of a master race. This is instead the rich dialectic, okay, this isn't Sacks anymore, the rich dialectic between the particular and the universal, which says some disciplined force is required to free everyone. In Deuteronomy, God chose the Jews not for their special righteousness, but for the wickedness of all the nations. Those stateless former slaves stood momentarily outside that awfulness. Walter Benjamin was right that in the idea of a classless society, Marx secularized messianic time. But there's something else too. The working class, Marx's particular agent for universal emancipation, follows a very old and very Jewish mold. Think now of Hanukkah, a small colonized population living under the domination of a mighty imperial power in historic Palestine, which sought to make the colonized disappear. A small band waged a struggle to be free. Who are their heirs today? Tribal particularism would say this is a story about Jews, meant only for Jews, and so we should support Jews in subjugation and in strength. To be sure, you can find this kind of thinking in the Bible and in our religious texts. These texts are all contested terrain. But there is a nobler tradition on my mind as I light the Hanukkah candles. It is the militancy of Moses and the prophet Amos and the Seder service, the radicalism which preaches utter insubordination to the oppressed everywhere. These are the words of Isaiah, and every Jew should know them because each year on Yom Kippur, when we fast and crowd into synagogues, we read these words. They're one of the Yom Kippur Haftorahs. This is Isaiah. Why, when we fasted, did you not see us, God? When we starved our bodies, did you pay no heed? Because on your fast day, you see to your business and oppress all your workers. Is this the fast I desire? A day for men to starve their bodies? No, this is the fast I desire, to unlock wicked bonds and untie the cords of the yoke, to let the oppressed go free, to break off every yoke. It is to share your bread with the hungry and to take the wretched poor into your home, when you see the naked to clothe him, and not to ignore your own kin. Then shall your light burst through like the dawn, and your healing spring up quickly. Your vindicator shall march before you. On the holiest day of the year, Jews are commanded to read those words, a condemnation by a prophet speaking in the name of God, directed against the Jews of his time. Jewish militants and Jewish radicals, Jewish universalists and Jewish egalitarians have often been a noisy minority within Jewish worlds, but the banners we carry and the flames we keep alive have the very noblest of all origins. I want to finish, and I'm Jewish, so this means I'll speak for another half hour. I want to finish with a story. Don't worry, I won't really. When I was an undergraduate student, I had the honor and the joy of meeting a great Jewish socialist whose name was Dennis Goldberg. Dennis was prepared to be maligned and imprisoned in the struggle to topple fascism and to bring about a new world. He was the only white defendant tried next to Nelson Mandela and sentenced to life behind bars. The ranks of the South African Communist Party were full of Jews like Dennis, heroes like Joe Slovo and Ruth First, murdered by an apartheid letter bomb. A minority among Jews who refused the comforts and the security of white life in South Africa and took up arms so that everyone might one day be free. Now, we're privileged to have one of them, Andrew Feinstein, with us tonight, so I won't say anything more about South Africa, but the lesson I took from Dennis was something broader. We packed out a hall in Oxford to hear him speak. Once he was a terrorist, the kind loathed in polite society, but today he stands as a respectable fighter for democracy. We rolled out the red carpet for him. But Dennis did not come to accept applause for what he had done in South Africa. He came, like so many Jewish radicals before him, to announce that the struggle was not over because everybody is not yet free. He came to speak of the plight of the Palestinian people. South Africans, like Jews, have so often generalized from the bitterness of their own experience to forge a gorgeous demand that nobody should ever live knocked forever onto their knees. And so Dennis had no interest in the applause of the rulers of the world, respectable liberals who today pretend that they always wanted democracy in South Africa. Dennis had many decades of thrown his lot in with a different family, and we should do the same. Today in South Africa, there's a museum of apartheid where children from all backgrounds learn of the horrors of the past and share the heroes of the struggle. One day, I hope, there will be the same in Palestine, a place where every child can identify with those who dreamed of freedom and kept hoping until they won. Today in Palestine, some children grow up under the shadow of checkpoints and walls and a blockade, prizing the keys to the homes from which their grandparents were chased. They have been demeaned and feared, and even to tell their stories and to speak the language of freedom is banned. Like the Maccabees, they refuse to disappear. A few miles away, other children grow up paranoid and afraid, living in stolen homes and fearful of the revenge of the wronged. It is no coincidence that the Palestinian struggle so offends the powerful everywhere. When they fly kites next to the soldiers whose guns keep them from their own homeland, when they seek the right to return and to undo their exile, theirs is a dream and a demand for a world beyond all the humiliations and the violence that scars the earth today, when some have rights and others are dispossessed. One day, though the night is long, and though it may seem unlikely, we believe that it will all be different. One day, the colonizers and the colonized will both be liberated together by coming to live with one another as human beings. And when that day comes, people will shake their heads and say, what took us so long? I think of this hope, and I remember Maimonides with his 13 principles of Jewish faith. The penultimate principle reads, Ani ma'amin be'emunah shlema b'vias HaMashiach, I believe with full faith in the coming of the Messiah. And Maimonides continues, and though the wait has been long, I await the coming of the Messiah with every day. Thank you so much, everyone. Happy Hanukkah.
Thank you so much, Barnaby. Well, so much to think about there, and the messianic concept, which is a concept rather than a thing that's at the heart of Jewish radicalism. Our bid and our need for understanding and knowing about all the courageous people who have stood firm in the face of injustice and continued to challenge that injustice and fight for a better world for everybody. Thank you so much. I'm going to welcome with open arms our next speaker, who is Naomi Wimborne Idrissi. You know the saying, if you want something done, ask a busy person. Well, Naomi Wimborne-Idrissi is that person. She's one of the most effective and tireless campaigners on the Jewish left. She's a retired primary school teacher and a former journalist, and she has campaigned for BDS since its inception in 2004 and is the International Solidarity Officer for Waltham Forest NEU, the National Education Union. She's also the media officer of Jewish Voice for Labour, a demanding and challenging role that she performs with great success and great diplomacy in a very difficult world. As of the 2nd of December, she's the suspended vice chair of Chingford and Woodford Green CLP, one of a whole tranche of Jewish members suspended by the Labour Party pending investigations. It's not a good look for the party, but what is good is the massive support and solidarity Naomi's received from across the country, and rightly so. Tonight she'll be reflecting on how she became a Jewish radical, but just before I ask her to speak, I think you need to know that today is her birthday. And where better to spend it than at a celebration of Jewish radicalism? So for this one moment during the event, can I invite you all to unmute just temporarily and say, Happy birthday, Naomi.
Oh.
Happy birthday, Naomi.
Naomi.
Birthday, Naomi.
Happy birthday,
Naomi from
Naomi.
Walthamstow.
Happy birthday to you.
Oh, happy birthday, Naomi.
Thank you so much.
Happy birthday.
Oh, everyone.
They've muted you as well, Julia.
That was a delightful rendition. We all wish you the very, very best, Naomi. Thank you very much for being with us today, and I'll hand over to you now.
Oh, thank you, everybody. That was very touching and beautifully sung. Couldn't have marvelous stuff. That's great. I'm quite daunted having to follow Barnaby, because he really does have the tones of an Old Testament prophet. A wonderful speaker and very inspiring. Thank you, Barnaby. I thought I might start off, some of you may not be aware of this, but there's a gentleman called David Hirsch, who is something of the needle in our sides as radical Jews who question Zionism. And he recently tweeted about me. Naomi Wimborne-Idrissi is one of the key spokespeople for anti-Semitic politics in Britain. Somebody with her politics should have no place in a democratic political party. This was Hirsch responding to Jewish Chronicle journalist Lee Harpin, who had tweeted triumphantly about my suspension, along with the chair of my constituency, Gary Leffley, and as Julia's mentioned, a whole swathe of others, some Jewish, but many not. And they're news tonight, and I know I'm not telling tales out of school. Alan Gibbons, a wonderful long-standing activist from the Northwest, secretary of his Labour Party up there, has been suspended as well. Somebody's not muted. I can hear some twittering. So, I mean, how does it come to this, that Jewish socialists can be accused by other Jews of being spokespeople for anti-Semitic politics? It's rather extraordinary, isn't it? I mean, look, my history goes back to my grandparents, all four of them East End Jews who came originally from Russia, from Poland, from Ukraine, and from East Germany, and they came over to Britain in the late 19th century and right at the beginning of the 20th. I've been asked to talk about how I became a Jewish radical. It's strange, really, because I feel that I just was. That was just the way things were in our home and in our family. So I had a very political household, Labour, and further left than that, there were communists in the family, particularly on my father's side. Everybody went on campaign for nuclear disarmament marches and so on and so on. So it was just natural for me when I was in school in secondary school, I joined something called the Schools Action Union. I wonder if anybody in this august company remembers that. I mean, we were youngsters, 15, 16 years old, being mentored by Trotskyists and Maoists from our local universities. And, you know, it was a really interesting training. Solidarity with the oppressed was just what you learned. Palestine, along with Vietnam, South Africa, Ireland, feminism, opposition to racism, opposition to fascism was just part of what I grew up with. And one of the people that I had the privilege to work with, an older activist then in Manchester, Steve Cohen, who many of you will know, we worked together on a booklet about something that was the subject of the last of Steve McQueen's astonishing small axe films. The designation of many Black children in schools in the 60s and 70s as educationally subnormal. I don't know if anybody saw that film on Sunday evening, but Steve Cohen and I and some other youngsters from the Schools Action Union produced a booklet about the terrible injustice of that time. So when it comes to looking at Israel, the family tradition was, as I said, left-wing, but we kind of had a quite beneficent view of Zionism. Lots of you will remember the little blue and white boxes on our mantelpieces where we put our coins to plant a tree in Israel. I had this idea of a sort of utopian Zionism, children of the kibbutz, communal living, this sort of thing. And it took me a while to realize, to learn that planting a tree in Israel meant supporting Jewish National Fund projects to obliterate the remains of destroyed Palestinian villages. We didn't learn that at that time. I did not, at any rate. I had to learn that. But as a student activist in Manchester, I began to get the message. And in February 1973, I spoke on behalf of the Socialist Society, condemning the Israeli fighter jets, which had shot down a Libyan Arab Airlines flight 114 from Tripoli to Cairo via Benghazi with many civilian casualties. And that was the first time I was accused of being a self-hating Jew. In fact, somebody came up to me after the meeting where the motion was carried, I hasten to say, and accused me of having an Arab boyfriend. It was inconceivable that any Jew should have sympathy with non-Jewish victims of Israeli violence. And that was a lesson for me. After that, well, I spent about 50 years patiently explaining to anybody who wanted to discuss the subject of Israel-Palestine with me that yes, I was Jewish, but no, that did not mean I was a Zionist. Yes, I was Jewish, but I was opposed to Zionism, and anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism were not the same thing. And I think over the decades that followed, we had some success. We had some success, so that by the time, you know, a couple of intifadas had been witnessed and the brutality with which they were oppressed, the idea that Palestinians were people with rights, a right to self-determination, as claimed by Zionists in Israel, that this was a cause which deserved support. And from 2004, as Julia mentioned, the BDS movement, Boycott, Divestment and Sanctions, was taking off and gaining strength. And I think if we look back, we can clearly see that it was at that point that the pro-Israel advocacy movement started to develop allegations of anti-Semitism against pro-Palestinian advocates as a weapon. And we have to state over and over again, don't we, that we abhor anti-Semitism, we abhor all forms of racism, we are aware, our antennae are tuned for signs of genuine hostility to Jews, and that has to be dealt with. But it cannot be dealt with by exaggerating, distorting and falsifying allegations of anti-Semitism against people who do not deserve those accusations. And of course, once that weapon was out there and available, it was quickly picked up by all the forces of the establishment who wanted to destroy Jeremy Corbyn and the movement around him. And this is something that has become the focus of my radicalism with Jewish Voice for Labour and many others in the Labour Party and associated with it, who have had to fight our corner for the last few years. And this is the context in which defending Jeremy Corbyn and his radical agenda, his anti-colonialism, his peace agenda, his determination to build a society for the many, not the few. This is how people like us can be accused by someone like David Hirsch of having no place in a democratic political party. So that's the state that we're in at the moment. So one of those many Jewish aphorisms that I think it was Julia referred to earlier is, if not now, when? And I'm sure it's been spoken in truth many, many times throughout Jewish history. But for us, this is it now. We have to defend the Palestinians and their right to speak out. We have to defend everyone who is in alliance with us politically. And there must be no Voldemorts. I'll explain what I mean about that. In the Harry Potter books, the hateful, evil character is he who shall not be named. And we're now in a position in the Labour Party where certain people are not to be mentioned, that expressing support or even an acknowledgement of their existence is sufficient for people to be put under investigation or even suspended. And I'm talking about Jackie Walker, Mark Wadsworth, Ken Livingstone, and others like them, who have been driven out of the party with the shadow of anti-Semitism hanging over them, even though that is not the crime for which they have been pushed out. And this is shameful and very, very dangerous for all of us. So we have to be working together with everybody who is on the right side of the fight against racism, against far-right white supremacism, which is a growing threat, against all forms of authoritarianism. And we have to fight those things together and not allow any people to be thrown under the bus, sacrificed for the sake of some longer-term project, which is not going to be worth a candle if we don't defend our allies. So I think my message today as a Jewish radical is basically hands off our movement. We must not be silenced. I think there's somebody wonderful coming up next who knows how not to be silenced. I'll leave it at that. Thanks, Julia.
Thank you so much, Naomi. We will not be silenced, and you've never been silenced. And not only that, you've been immensely articulate and powerful and convincing in your challenge against injustice. So thank you very much for that. And I'm going to hand over to you now to introduce Leon and that part of the programme, and I'll come back afterwards. Thank you.
Great. Oh, well, this is a great privilege. So we're going to meet now Leon Rosselson. Leon is a singer, a writer, an activist, the child of Jewish refugees from Tsarist Russia. Leon and I have known one another for quite some time because of our ardent support for the boycott, divestment and sanctions movement. And it's wonderful to have him here. For 6 decades, song has been the medium through which, in the words of the song we're about to hear, he has been challenging authority and standing against the powers that be. So I don't know if somebody's going to play the song, My Father's Jewish World, or if Leon is going to appear first to say hello to us. How is that going to work? Aha.
My father came here as a boy from Tsarist Russia, from Vilkovishki in the Pale, those reservations for the Jews. His schooling was the Talmud and the Torah, the writings of the rabbis and their laws. Music was his door to freedom, Yiddish was his mother tongue, and home was just a dreamland in a song. He told us stories of his gentle rabbi father, and of his mother who was fearless and the hardships that they faced. And when the drunken peasants got together and yelled, "Let's kill the Jews for killing Christ," his mother grabbed the rolling pin she used to make the Sabbath bread and ran to crack their skulls. My father said, "It's not a nation, not a religion. This Jewish spirit is still unbroken. It's like the candle that mocks the darkness. It's like the song that shatters the silence. It's like the fool who laughs at the dragon. It's like the spark that signals rebellion. It's like the dance that circles unending. He lived in England, half belonging, half a stranger, always feeling much as I do on the outside looking in. In time he grew to be an unbeliever. Religion had become a mental chain. Abandoned God, became a Jewish atheist, and then with pride a communist until the day he died. So no more Bible, but instead a daily worker. People came and people argued, asking questions how and why. Revolution, Stalin, Trotsky, Soviet Russia. 2 Jews, 3 opinions, so they say. God loves the poor and helps the rich, the Jewish father tells his son, and so you've got to choose whose side you're on. It's not a nation, not a religion. This Jewish spirit is still unbroken. It's like the candle that mocks the darkness. It's like the song that shatters the silence. It's like the fool who laughs at the dragon. It's like the spark that signals rebellion. It's like the dance that circles unending. He read the books of Jewish rebels like Spinoza, and he sang songs that laughed at rabbis in a language that's not mine. He loved the Yiddish stories and their humour born from poverty and pain. Sleep faster, but we need the pillows. How else could the Jews survive and keep their tattered dreams and hopes alive? But now my father's Jewish world has gone forever, burned in the flames of hatred, nothing left but ash and dust. And Yiddish lingers on out of nostalgia. How can I make some meaning from what's past? And the steak they say is Jewish, carved from stolen land, brings only shame by torturing and killing in our name. It's not a nation, not a religion. This Jewish spirit is still unbroken. It's like the candle that mocks the darkness. It's like the song that shatters the silence. It's like the fool who laughs at the dragon. It's like the spark that signals rebellion. It's like the dance that circles unending. Now it's my father's face that meets me in the mirror, and I wonder what to me his Jewish legacy has been. The state of always being an outsider, of asking why, then asking why again. That precious strand of Jewishness that challenges authority and dares to stand against the powers that be. Emma Goldman, Rosa Luxemburg, Bar Kokhba, the Jewish anarchists and socialists who fought to free the poor, the ones who meet injustices with anger and will not let their dreams drown in despair, who speak up for the refugees, defend the weak against the strong. It's for these rebel Jews I sing my song. It's not a nation, not a religion. This Jewish spirit is still unbroken. It's like the candle that mocks the darkness. It's like the song that shatters the silence. It's like the fool who laughs at the dragon. It's like the spark that signals rebellion. It's like the dance that circles unending.
That's excellent. What a lovely song. Just in case people missed it, there's a joke in there. It says, sleep faster, we need the pillows. Leon might want to comment on that. But Leon, we're going to talk to you in a second. there's some many beautiful lines in that poem, evocative lines, like the spark that signals rebellion. For these rebel Jews, I sing my song. So, Leon, can you tell us how you came to write this particular song, which is so fitting for this evening?
First of all, can I just point out, I don't know what the CD was being played on, but my guitar doesn't sound anything like that. It's a bit painful in my ears.
Oh.
That's Zoom for you.
Yeah.
It came about actually. I was actually commissioned to write this song. In 2002, an outfit called the Wren Trust down in Devon asked if I would write a song about what it means to be Jewish, living in this country, which is my country after all. I'm not. And it was for a multicultural concert on the last night of the Sidmouth Folk Festival. This is 2002. And it baffled me a bit because multicultural concert, I didn't kind of think I mean, Jews are not immigrants. They're well settled in this country. They are not recent immigrants. So I wondered quite what it was about. But I like a challenge, and I decided that I would write about what it means to be Jewish for someone like me who is neither a Zionist nor religious. And it was quite a challenge. I asked around for a few, but I think I asked Dave and Julia also what they thought. And I decided that I would start with the idea, which is not altogether justified historically, I should say, that Jews were disproportionately represented in radical movements, in revolutions, the Bolsheviks, socialists, Mensheviks, anarchists particularly. There were a lot of Jews in all these movements. And in looking, as has been mentioned in the South Africa, the anti-apartheid movement, according to Julian Slovo, most of the whites, South Africans who opposed actively apartheid were Jews. In the civil rights movement in the 60s, again, they had rabbis in New York thundering sermons about justice, justice you shall pursue, of course, and a lot of Jews took part in the marches until, of course, remember 3 activists were murdered by the Ku Klux Klan. 2 of them were Jewish. So that was kind of a starting point. But I should point out that although a lot of Jews were active in South Africa, most Jews were not. Most Jews accepted their privileged status, and in fact the Board of Deputies of South Africa didn't actually oppose officially apartheid, I think, until 1985. Somebody will correct me if that's wrong. And in the 60s, the Jewish communities in the southern states, again, reconciled themselves to segregation because it's, in a sense, it suited their class interests, which overrode whatever other instincts they had of justice from their Jewish background, as it always does, I suppose. So that was the starting point. And I suppose it's summed up by Isaac Babel, a Russian writer who fought on the Bolshevik side in the Civil War, saying that I am a Jew because of my unconditional solidarity with the persecuted and the exterminated. So I went through all that, and I also found stories about Jews challenging God, that really challenging authority. And actually, in Jewish religion, you would actually challenge the authority of God. I could tell you a joke there, but I'm not going to. But it was a kind of a nice idea. Shall I tell you the story?
You may not have time to talk about the other things I know you want to talk about, unfortunately. Let's see if we've got time after we.
But in the end, you cannot write a song. You should not write a song based on generalizations like that, based on arguments, based on theses or anything. You have to write a song which tells a story about people. That's my view of song. That's what you should do. That's what I've always done. So I decided to base it on my father. I can talk about him. He came to this country in 1914. Both my parents were refugees from Tsarist Russia, as you said. He came in 1914, basically because his voice broke. Strange. If it hadn't, I probably wouldn't be here today. He was, it's complicated. His mother divorced her first husband for smoking on the Sabbath. And she had one son, married an older man who was in the Tsarist army, and therefore gave her permission to live in Moscow. Most, of course, Jews were not, had to live in the Pale, but the special people, especially rich Jews, noble Jews, were allowed to live in Moscow. And she was the keeper of the kosher kitchens in the house of a very rich family called the Polyakovs. I've always wondered whether Stephen Polyakov, the dramatist, was from that family. But anyway, that's what she was. And when my father was born, because she already had a son, she didn't register his birth. So he was in Tsarist Russia and didn't exist officially at all. This is why he made his way, his father was a rabbi traveling around, made his way to Moscow at one point to live with his mother because there was nobody at home. And of course he had a beautiful treble boy's voice, managed to get into the choir, a very large synagogue in Moscow, and was paid for that. But when he was 14, his voice broke, so he had no future in Tsarist Russia. She took him to England and to live with his uncle, her brother, the Rabbi Newman. That's his story. So he came here knowing nothing.
Yeah. I'm going to hurry you up because I know you've got lots of other things to say.
Yeah.
But we've only got a few minutes. Can I ask you a question? A question to bring out one or two of the other things I know you wanted to talk about. You told me that you were 14 in 1948, that critical date, the year of Israel's War of Independence and the Palestinian Nakba. So I wonder, how did you perceive it then? How did your views on Israel-Palestine evolve after that? And how do you feel about the things we've been talking about today, where we can't really talk about Israel-Palestine with any honesty? I think you've got about 2 minutes.
No, I can't talk about it in 2 minutes. In 1948, actually, my father, as the song says, was a communist when he discovered what was happening in the world, as opposed to what he thought from his education in the Pale. So actually, the family were broadly supportive of the state of Israel, because it was the Czechoslovakia, which is of course Eastern Europe, actually provided arms for the Haganah, and the Soviet Union had voted for partition, which was probably good enough for my father. But he never became a Zionist ever. He was a communist till the day he died. And with being a communist, of course, he did side with the oppressed. And we knew about Belsen, but we never knew anything about the Nakba at that time. It was completely out of the narrative. There wasn't such a narrative existing, as far as I know. Although some communists had, I remember the party discussing the possibility of a binational state rather than a Jewish state. That must have been quite daring at the time. So, and I was also a member of the Hashem Hatzair in my teens, which is an education. Hashem Hatzair claimed to be socialist Zionist at a time when it didn't seem an impossible contradiction, which of course it is. but they taught me a lot about Zionism. The first thing was that I didn't really belong in this country, and Jewish life in the diaspora was inferior, and I should rise up to make Aliyah rise up to a more superior life in the Jewish state, preferably on the kibbutz. A lot of the people in Hashomer, when I was in it, did end up on the kibbutz. Zikim, which was quite near the Gaza border, and as I discovered later on, was built as many kibbutzim were on the ruins of an Arabic village. And most of the refugees there were driven, ended up in Gaza. So their descendants are now being generally imprisoned and bombed. And then in 58, 59, I went to Israel to accompany have I 2 minutes are up? Went to accompany an Israeli singer called Zimra Ornat, with whom I had made a record for Topic, but that didn't last very long, but I did stay there for over a year. And what struck me then, which is interesting, is that most of the secular Jews there never, secular Israelis, I should say, didn't consider themselves particularly Jewish. Jewishness for them was the religion which restricted their lives. They weren't, they were Israeli. The idea of Jewishness was not a big thing. And in fact, at the time, they weren't demanding to be recognized as a Jewish state. They didn't need to, because the narrative, the Palestinian narrative, Palestinians, of course, were under military rule at the time until 1966, I think, and they didn't exist in the narrative, in the discourse at the time. But what was most interesting, I think, was the racism in the country. Me being from a Western country was kind of fairly high up in the hierarchy. At the top were the Sabras, of course, the Israeli-born Jews, or the Israeli-born new Jews, let's say, and at the bottom were the Mizrahi Jews, the Jews from Yemen and the Arabic countries, and that was the way it was. They were generally, and of course, Holocaust survivors were also right at the bottom. They were the sheep who'd gone into slaughter without fighting, and so they were ashamed. And in fact, the Holocaust also was not part of the narrative at the time, because it didn't need to be, and because they were ashamed of the Jews who had, as I say, had just gone slaughtered without fighting back. In fact, I think it was the Eichmann trial that brought the Holocaust into the narrative in 1961. So it was all that, but I did not discover an alternative narrative. I didn't I didn't evolve until 1967. I think it was the 6-Day War made me feel that there were, first of all, they lied about it. Even Abba Iban, who was the representative of the United Nations, lied about it and said in the United Nations that the war had started because Egypt attacked Israel. And I've met a lot of people who still believe that's the way the 6-Day War started.
Leon, we would love to go on chatting to you, but I think our time is up. Am I right, Julia?
Yeah, I'm really sorry. It would just be lovely to hear more.
Let me just say that
yes,
I've written a number of songs about Israel and Palestine, which are collected on a CD called The Last Chance. The Last Chance is placed in Beersheba, where I spent a lot of time when I was in Israel. And it's an argument based on an argument between a Jewish nationalist and a Yiddish-speaking diaspora Jew. That may be interesting, and the sound of the guitar is perfectly
much better. That's worth knowing. So everybody take note of that. The Last Chance, the CD with plenty of Leon songs. No doubt we can find it on Spotify, and I hope you get some money from if we do that.
Don't get any money from Spotify.
Oh no, sorry I said that. Take it away. Thank you, Leon. Thank you very much. We're going to hand back to Julia now for the rest of the evening. Do stay with us.
And
Cheers.
thank you from me too, Naomi. That was great from you. And Leon, you know, I've known you for many decades, and I recognise so much of your description of what Israel is like, what it was like then, and that downgrading of the diaspora. I just wanted to thank you for one song, another one about your father, that the Song of the Old Communist, which when I first heard it, I just burst into tears because it's such a beautiful song of love, which shines a light on the contradictions and the difficulties, but also really brings to life the suffering and the poverty and the struggle, but also the confidence that the Communist Party gave people to fight back, and a sense that they were valuable, which the world was telling them that they were not. So thank you for everything, all of your songs, but that one has a particular place in my heart. Now, you talked about the downgrading of the diaspora, and that is a good bridge to our next speaker. But before I introduce him, I just wanted to remind everybody that if you have any comments or questions that you want to ask the panel, please put them in the chat. We can't have people asking personal questions because the number of people here is just too big. But please, we do encourage you to put your questions in the chat, and we will look at all of them and pick out a diverse range. And now I'm very pleased to welcome our next speaker, David Rosenberg, who is a writer, educator, activist and tour guide of London's radical history. He's an expert on radical Jewish history and politics, an active member of the Jewish Socialists Group, a tireless blogger and tweeter, and the author of a book of historical walks, Rebel Footprints, and Battle for the East End, about the Battle of Cable Street. In 2016, David was convener of Cable Street 80, a huge event with thousands of people to commemorate the people's defeat of Mosley's black shirts on the 4th of October in 1936. On that day, the Jews of the East End, with their non-Jewish neighbours alongside them, defied instructions from the Board of Deputies to stay at home and pull down the shutters. So for those not familiar with internal Jewish politics, it's useful to know that these struggles have a long history. They're not new. Instead of pulling down the shutters, they came out of their houses in their hundreds of thousands. They drove the fascists out of the East End and made their streets safer again. Tonight, though, David won't be on that territory exactly, but he'll be exploring a Jewish radical tradition that has relevance for all of us today. So thanks very much for joining us, David, and over to you.
Thanks very much. Great to be here. In 2013, a remarkable museum called Polin opened in a location that 80 years ago was part of the Warsaw Ghetto, and I visited it several times. The history that most Jews around the world have been taught is that Poland is nothing but a Jewish graveyard. 1,000 years of continuous presence collapsed into 6 years of utter destruction, when 90% of Poland's 3.3 million Yiddish-speaking working-class Jews were wiped out by the Nazis, with operations to find hidden Jews carried out by auxiliary Polish police. Today, under Poland's ultra-reactionary government, admired by Johnson in Britain and Netanyahu in Israel, you can be punished for exposing Polish wartime collaboration. And yet, a pluralist Jewish life is reviving in 15 Polish cities today. They don't have one central body there, like the Board of Deputies, who arrogantly declare what the community believes. And they're not so susceptible to Israeli pressure on their priorities. If Keir Starmer visited there, he'd be flummoxed, having to consider several Jewish opinions instead of one. The museum, Polin, showcases 1,000 years of Polish Jewish life, culture, interaction with non-Jews, intellectual creativity, periods of terror and hardship, but also long-lasting golden ages. Only part of it focuses on those 6 years of annihilation. One compelling display marks the late 19th century, when most Polish Jews lived under Tsarist rule, but new radical ideas promising liberation and self-determination were spreading. The Zionist idea, territorial self-determination in Palestine, was one among several. It was challenged from day one by Jews who advanced alternative ways to build equal lives for Jews as a minority wherever they lived, whether centered on religious identity, secular cultural autonomy, or integration strategies. So when you next hear some Schmendrick, that's Yiddish for fool, say anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism, remind them anti-Zionism was invented, first used and developed by Jews for positive reasons, though we don't own the copyright. Today, when people discuss self-determination, not least in the dubious IHRA definition, our notion of it is so impoverished. It refers only to territorial self-determination in Israel, a fortress state built on dispossessing and expelling so many Palestinians in 1948, and then denying self-determination to Palestinians who remained. 21% of Israelis today are Palestinians who endure multiple discrimination. Israel also rules brutally over 2.2 million Palestinians in the occupied West Bank. Palestinian refugees, whether from 48 or 67, cannot return. Under Israel's 2018 nation-state law, only Jews are entitled to national self-determination in Israel, not indigenous Palestinians, migrant workers or refugees. And that law was passed during a state visit by Netanyahu's chum, Viktor Orban, who used anti-Semitic propaganda targeting George Soros to win the Hungarian election that year. You couldn't make it up. If Israel doesn't want to be labeled an apartheid state, it can repeal the nation-state law and law of return, dismantle discrimination, confiscate arms from illegal settlers, make Jewish-only roads available to all. It can make laws to ensure that Israel-Palestine is a state for all its citizens equally, whether in one state or two. Despite repression, growing numbers of left-wing Israelis and human rights bodies are working for that goal, protesting, publishing, refusing army service, making illegal solidarity visits. Here in Britain, we can support justice there by amplifying activities by progressive Israeli Jews, as well as exposing brutality towards Palestinians. Zionism proclaimed the ingathering of Jews in one nation state, and yet 72 years after independence, a majority of Jews, including many Israelis, choose to practice Jewish self-determination elsewhere, in London, Paris, Berlin, Toronto, New York, Melbourne, Kiev, Warsaw. Those who shout loudest about defending Jewish self-determination are not talking about enhancing the creative, diasporic Jewish self-determination, which already exists, but they want to talk about defending an ethnocracy in Israel. The Israeli ruling class and their supporters among Jewish so-called leaders outside don't like other Jews using their self-determined voice to denounce Israeli racism. Emanuel Scherer, a Polish-born member of the Bund, a secular left-wing anti-Zionist Jewish movement, once wrote, "Rights and justice for Jews everywhere, without wrongs and injustice to other people anywhere." At this point, I'm going to ask for screen to come up. Yeah, there's some images relating to the Bund, which was the movement I started talking about there. Political Zionism and Bundism were both born in 1897. The first at a plush conference in Bâle, the other in an illegal house gathering in Vilnius. The Bund sought to link the struggles of Jews with those of workers throughout the Russian Empire for socialism. Bundism and Zionism had opposite values. In optimism versus pessimism, internationalism versus nationalism, integration versus isolation and evacuation. The Bund accused the Zionists of worshipping the same nationalist values as regimes that oppress Jews and other minorities. The Bund threw itself into the Russia's revolutionary upheavals in 1905 and 1917, but also engaged very critically with Lenin and warned about the Bolsheviks' anti-democratic tendencies. The Bund socialism was from the bottom up. Its heyday as a mass movement was in 1930s Poland, where it had a daily Yiddish newspaper, other publications in Polish and Yiddish. It organized strikes and built a whole world of institutions, libraries, schools, sports clubs, cultural projects, a Bundist women's movement, youth movement, children's organization, a sanatorium funded by trade unions for children at risk of TB. And that sanatorium was run on democratic children's rights principles. As Poland slid into semi-fascism, the Bund and the Polish Socialist Party activists jointly led the political and physical struggle against anti-Semitism. Apart from one small faction, Zionists and religious Jews abstained from that fight in the 1930s, while communists were too obsessed with a trade union turf war with the Bundists to defend Jews. In the last municipal elections before the Nazi invasion, the Bund won massive victories among Jewish voters in major Polish cities where Jews comprise a third of the population. Many religious Jews voted for secular socialists, the Bund, who defended them from anti-Semites. In the ghettos, in the early 40s, Bundists, communists and left Zionists united in armed anti-Nazi resistance. The Holocaust decimated the Bund. Its post-war presence has been marginal, but its philosophy of diasporic self-determination and its fundamental critique of Zionism remains absolutely pertinent today. Zionism represses Palestinians daily, but also through insisting on the centrality of Israel to Jews, it undermines diaspora Jewish lives. It divides us from other minorities and other allies with grave consequences. Two examples. In semi-fascist Argentina, late 1970s, thousands of political opponents disappeared. Jews were 1% of the population, but more than 10% of those that disappeared, under a regime armed to the teeth by Israel. In apartheid South Africa, the most progressive Jews joined the ANC. When I interviewed a Jew who had worked in the ANC's armed wing, he told me that Jewish establishment bodies handed over names and addresses of Jewish activists to apartheid authorities. I will end back in Poland. Last year, 12 Jewish Socialist Group members went to Warsaw. We met left activists, historians, a socialist choir, visited museums and Treblinka death camp. On our final day, we joined hundreds of local anti-racist and anti-fascists, some Jewish, in an alternative Warsaw Ghetto uprising commemoration. We were stunned by the symbolic presence of the Bund on banners, placards and slogans in Yiddish songs sung by a non-Jewish school choir. The same Polish anti-racists and anti-fascists are in the front line today, defending Roma, defending Muslims, while also fighting homophobia and attacks on women's reproductive rights. Poland's reactionary government and Britain's Conservative government are the main partners in a Council of Europe grouping that now includes the ultra-right AfD in Germany, the Vox Party in Spain, Salvini's Northern League. And if those in Britain who claimed to care about anti-Semitism were serious, they would turn the heat on those parties abroad and on the Tories at home. But they don't make a peep about this, partly because those parties support Netanyahu. Jews and other minorities really deserve better. Thanks.
Thank you very much, David. That was a very moving and powerful speech. And what you were describing, the activism that you were describing, I've been asked to explain the concept of Doigkeit, and I think what you were describing is Doigkeit. Doigkeit is a Bundist conception of here-ness, that wherever Jews live, that's where they belong, and that all Jewish communities anywhere in the world have equal validity, and that our future depends on us living alongside, in amongst, and in solidarity with other minorities and with our allies, wherever we are. and that's what gives us strength. And nationalism can fatally undermine that commitment to the places where we live. So thank you very much for that. I'm now going to read a poem by Irene Klepfisch called Der Fremde in der Fremd. Irene Klepfisch is an amazing woman with an amazing life. Her biography spans several generations and incorporates the most cataclysmic events of the last 80 years. She was born in April 1941 in the Warsaw Ghetto. Her parents, Roszka and Michal Klepfisch, were Bundists. Early in 1943, Irena's father, Michal, smuggled her and her mother, Roszka, out of the ghetto. Irena was placed in a Catholic orphanage, and Roszka used false papers to get work as a maid for a non-Jewish Polish family. Michal was hidden by a Catholic family. He was a chemist, and he made improvised bombs to smuggle to the resistance fighters inside the ghetto. He took his last consignment of bombs in after the ghetto uprising had started, knowing that he would not come out again. He was killed on the second day of the uprising. The Warsaw Ghetto uprising was finally crushed in May 1943, by which time the Nazis had deported around 300,000 people from the ghetto to the death camp at Treblinka. Roszka retrieved Irena from the orphanage and fled to the Polish countryside, where they were hidden by Polish peasants, and they survived the war. In 1946, they moved to the town of Lodz, as it's called in Yiddish, Łódź in Polish. Then later that year to Sweden. Finally, in 1949, they got to New York, where they settled with other Bundist survivors in a housing co-op in the Bronx. Irena's mother, Rose, lived to the age of 102, working first as a seamstress and then as an archivist. Irena's now 80 years old and a friend of ours. She became an academic, a poet, a writer, and a teacher of English, women's studies, and Yiddish, as well as being a feminist, lesbian, and secular Jewish activist. And she's a lifelong Bundist. She also founded the Jewish Women's Committee to end the occupation of the West Bank and Gaza. Her most recent bilingual poem is Der Fremde in der Fremd, Stranger in a Strange Land. It's written in English and Yiddish, the mother tongue of millions of Jews who lived in Eastern and Central Europe, most of whom were murdered by the Nazis. This poem is an example of living Yiddish, a language and a culture that has survived all the attempts to wipe it out and is starting to thrive again across the world. Don't worry if you don't know the Yiddish, all the words are translated and you will understand. Gedenkst, do you remember, when you were a stranger among strangers? A Fremde on Papieren, a stranger without papers. Gedenkst die Frages, those endless questions. Wer seid ihr? Von wannen kommen ihr? Who are you? Where are you from? Why are you here and not there? Wer seinen gewen eure Schreinim? Who were your neighbours? Where was the school? What work did you do? What can you do here that you couldn't do there? Noch einmal, for the third, fourth, fifth time. Wer seid ihr? Von wann kommt ihr? Who are you? Where are you from? Why are you here and not there? Wer ist der Mann? Wer ist die Frau? Who is this man? Who is this woman? Und die Papieren, and their papers. Und das Kind. And this child, did you find it here or bring it from there? Do you have a passport for him, for her? For ein Kind, that one with the dark hair. Noch einmal, for the 10th, 11th, 12th time. Wer seid ihr? Von wannen kommt ihr? Who are you? Where are you from? Why are you here and not there? Who do you know here? Who did you know there? Where will you sleep here, and how did you sleep there? Un eure chaloimus. What did you dream there? And what did you dream of there? Where will you work here? What work did you do there? And why can't you just work there? Wo ist die Visa, die grüne Karte, der Passport, Visa, green card, passport, photo, from here and from there? And why did you cut your hair? Und das Kind, why did you bring this child here and not leave it there? Noch einmal, for the 18th, 19th, 20th time. Wer seid ihr? Von wannen kommt ihr? Für was seid ihr da und nicht geblieben dorten? Why are you here and why didn't you just stay there? I'm now going to introduce Andrew Feinstein. I'm really, really delighted to introduce him as our final speaker before the panel. Andrew is a former ANC MP in the South African Parliament, and now he lives in Britain, where he continues to make his mark for peace and justice as a researcher and campaigner on corruption in the global arms trade. He's a prize-winning documentary filmmaker and author of The Shadow World, Inside the Global Arms Trade. He'll be familiar to many of our audience from his powerful and uncompromising campaigning videos about the uses and abuses of anti-Semitism that have gone viral on social media. He'll be talking about Jewish radicalism in South Africa, which Barnaby touched on. And then after that, he's going to chair the panel discussion. So, Andrew, thank you very much for being here, and I'll hand over to you now.
Thanks so much, Julia. It's indeed a great honor and a pleasure to be with you this evening and to be on a virtual platform with such an extraordinary array of people. And I would particularly like to thank the organizers and Emily, who I believe conceived of this evening's event. Also, very quickly, a huge happy birthday to Naomi. I was misfortunate. Not only was I born white in a racist oligarchic state in Africa, and therefore had an extremely comfortable life at many levels, but being the child of a South African father and a Jewish Viennese mother, I also spent the first 12 years of my life living between Cape Town and various parts of Europe, particularly Vienna. As a consequence of being outside of South Africa for periods of time, even at a very young age, I knew about the banned illegal ANC. Having in one's possessions the words of any member of the ANC, a photograph of any member of the ANC, would have been enough for a long-term prison sentence in South Africa. But as a child growing up, I was able to read and even hear the words of Nelson Mandela at his treason trial, when he spoke about the ambitions of creating a South Africa in which all could live together. I also was stunned by the fact that so many of the leaders of the liberation struggle against apartheid in South Africa were Jewish. To mention just a few: Joe Slovo, Ruth First, Dennis Goldberg, Albie Sachs. I have had the enormous privilege of getting to know all of them, besides Ruth, who tragically and traumatically was murdered by a parcel bomb sent to her in Mozambique, where she was teaching, by the South African Apartheid Security Services. South African Jews came predominantly from Central and Eastern Europe. Many were Litvaks from what is today Lithuania, Estonia, or Latvia. And the story of their journeys and their arrivals in South Africa are myriad and varied. My own family story, and I'm not sure that this is a family myth or not, is that the family, to flee the Tsarist pogroms, bought passage to New York, but were dropped in Cape Town Harbor, wondering why they hadn't seen the Statue of Liberty on their journey into their new home. Many of the families who settled in South Africa not only experienced various forms of oppression, repression, by dint of their, but very active roles in politics, including the establishment of the first in what became the Soviet Union. Many of these families were driven by their history and experience of suffering. But what is extraordinary about the way in which they turned that suffering, that history, into a global struggle against all oppression, against all inequality. Now, this is not for a moment to say that all South African Jews were on the side of the oppressed, were a part of the liberation struggle against apartheid. In fact, the number of whites engaged in the struggle against apartheid were a tiny, tiny minority, disproportionately Jewish. But to understand the breadth of the Jewish community, diverse, conflicted as any community anywhere is, let us not forget that the man who prosecuted Nelson Mandela in his first treason trial, where he sought the death penalty for Mandela, was also a Jew, Percy Utah. But while Percy Utah was prosecuting the non-racial broad leadership of the underground struggle, Joe Slovo was becoming leader and deputy commander-in-chief of the ANC's armed wing, Umkhonto we Sizwe. Dennis Goldberg, an engineer trained at my own first university, the University of Cape Town, became the armed struggle's preeminent bomb maker, or in his own words, its only bomb maker. First was a towering intellectual and trade unionist, so tragically killed in Mozambique. Let us also forget that these extraordinary individuals were perceived of, labeled and branded, most of white South Africa, as ogres, as evil. And this included the organized Jewish community, the Jewish Board of Deputies, which, as has been mentioned tonight, only came out in explicit criticism of the system of apartheid in the mid-1980s, in the late apartheid period, was not only unsupportive of the many Jews engaged in the liberation struggle, but was incredibly of them, demeaned them personally and politically. And this continued for many years, even at the time when we were contesting our first ever democratic elections in 1994, as a white and a Jew who supported the ANC and Nelson Mandela, I was often vilified. An atrocious anti-Semitism was used to describe my political views. But we should never forget that it was these pioneering Jewish South African liberation fighters who were responsible for convincing convince the ANC that the route to democracy, equality, and justice in South Africa was a non-racial route. This was one of the most powerful and important contributions made by any grouping in the struggle against apartheid. And the extraordinary thing was that so many of these people who sacrificed so much, so not just with enormous courage and fortitude, but often with remarkable sense of humor. There is the story that I'll very briefly tell of Dennis Goldberg, who was on trial in what was known as second treason trial, and as has been mentioned, was the only white amongst the convicted in that second treason trial. His elderly mother in the audience was hard of hearing. All those on trial for treason expected to receive the death sentence. It was only because of incredibly smart lawyers who made it clear to the apartheid state that they would have to make available to the defense legal team certain national security information that they were not prepared to put into the public domain, that instead they got life imprisonment. But when the judge was reading their sentence, Dennis's mother didn't hear. And she shouted at Dennis from the seats to where he was in the dock, "Dennis, Dennis, what did the judge say?" Dennis turned and shouted back to his elderly Jewish mother, "Mother, it's life. It's life. And isn't life beautiful?" And it was with that fortitude and courage that many of those treason trialists, including Dennis Goldberg, served over 20 years in the harshest conditions imaginable, while Mandela and others were put through enormous physical trauma on Robben Island, years of his 22 in jail. Dennis was on his own as the only white politician in a isolation and solitude that I have absolutely no idea how any human being could survive. Crucially, when Dennis Goldberg was released from prison earlier than the others, he was immediately deported to Israel, where his daughter lived. On his arrival, he immediately made a statement about his deep, deep concern with the Israeli occupation of Palestine. He made clear that he had no desire to stay in Israel and soon made his way to the United Kingdom. And for Jews engaged apart in South Africa, the Palestinian has been absolutely crucial to them. They outspoken in support of the Palestinian struggle and in need to isolate Israel. And for those of us who experienced the struggle against apartheid, we have seen with our own eyes the impact of an international BDS movement. And that is why we believe that it is only through boycott sanctions that the Israeli government will in any way reconsider its brutal, illegal occupation of Palestine. Just as the apartheid regime was forced to loosen its grip on power when the world's major banks, known as the Paris Group of 20, refused to roll over South Africa's in the late 1980s. And I would like to end by also reading something from Irina Klepfish, who, as Julia so beautifully described, was a child survivor of the Warsaw Ghetto. She wrote have concluded that one way to those we love, who stood and did, is to hold on to their fierce outrage at the life of their people. It is this outrage we must use to actions, vision, whenever we see signs of options of common life, the hysteria of a mother grieving for the teenager who has been shot, and in front of a vandalized or demolished, displaced, unjust laws that demand closing and open, humiliation whose culture is deemed in fear, a kinship, living under military rule. Because of our experience, we recognize these obstacles to peace. These moments of recognition, we remember the past, feel the outrage that inspired the ghetto to guide us in present struggle. Let me add words of my former boss, 27 Mandela, our is incomplete without the freedom of Palestinian people. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Andrew. That was powerful, moving, inspiring, and just a most wonderful resource, really, for all of us, whether we're Jewish radicals or other sorts of radicals, or anybody struggling for justice and peace in extremely hostile circumstances, but at the moment nothing like as hostile as what those people you're describing were struggling through. So thank you very much for that. We were having a bit of trouble with your technology, and I don't know whether you can hear us properly, or whether you'll be able to ask the questions of the panel. But if your technology is still having problems, I can take over that role and maybe hand back to you if things resolve themselves. Could I have some advice about that?
Please do, because he can't hear. So please take over if you don't mind.
Okay, thank you very much. So we now have our panel. And I'm really sorry that Andrew isn't able to do this, because I think he would be doing a wonderful job. And if he comes back online properly, I would be very happy to hand back to him. Our panel is Naomi, Barnaby, and David. I think that's everybody on the panel, isn't it? Yeah. And we've got a number of questions, and I wanted to start with one which was posted in the chat, which is for all of you, really. I mean, everybody's well qualified to answer this, but maybe Barnaby, because he's based in the United States, might have a very well-informed take on it. Paul Mishler says, I've just finished a conference on the Jewish left in the US. Any thoughts on the differences between the US Jewish left and that in the UK? And, I'd add the implications of those differences for how we do our activism. So let's start with Barnaby.
Thank you so much. It's so wonderful to listen to Andrew, and it's such an honor not only to share a platform with him this evening, but to know every time I see him on TV making any kind of appearance, to think, wow, that's the kind of Jew I want to feel is part of the same Jewish tradition as me. I mean, I don't want to flatter myself. I haven't done the things Andrew Feinstein's done, but to think that I'm part of the same principles that he champions, people who believe that life is indeed beautiful and should be made beautiful for everyone, is a very, very wonderful thing. So it's moving to be on the same event as Andrew. In response to your question, I mean, I know, yeah, everyone will have thoughts about this. There is a difference. There are all sorts of interesting differences between Jewish communities in the US and the UK. The Jewish community in the US still votes very largely for the Democratic Party, not the Republicans, whereas most of the Jews in Britain now, most of the polling evidence suggests, vote for the Conservative Party. Though it should be said, when I was in Shul on Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur, just before Trump's election, was the only place in Manhattan where I heard people sat around talking about how they were going to vote for Donald Trump. Orthodox Jews are still, I think, more likely to vote Republican. Jews, that is, fall along the same kinds of splits that so much of America falls along, and more religious people who are more religious Jews who are worried about the same kinds of cultural issues that evangelical Christians are worried about tend more to be on the right. But the Democratic Party supporting liberal American mainstream is still very radically different from a Jewish left. That is to say, it supports a Democratic Party that has long supported the state of Israel and also, you know, pushed through Clintonite welfare reforms and did all sorts of awful things domestically. So the exciting thing about America is not that the majority of the community supports the Democrats rather than the Republicans, but that there is a very, very vibrant Jewish left, which is different from that liberal majority. And I think we're bringing some of that spirit to the UK now. I see organizations populated by lots of new young people becoming politicized, like Na'amod, a new organization of Jews against the occupation, campaigning against the Board of Deputies and against the appearance of unanimous Jewish support for the far right in Israel. And I see also on the domestic front, things like, I think they're called Jewish Solidarity Action, who activists who on Hanukkah in Golders Green were out supporting striking workers, which is a really wonderful, inspiring thing. And these are lessons, I think, taken from a very vibrant Jewish left in America. So it is certainly the case that groups like If Not Now and Jewish Voice for Peace, and also, you know, these are groups focused on solidarity with the Palestinian people, and also domestically groups like the Jewish Vote, JFRED, Jews for Racial and Economic Justice, who are focused not simply on solidarity with Palestine, but also on a Jewish left-wing, Jewish socialist voice that has been absent for too long. It's true that in America, those are dynamic and growing. And I think that people are beginning to take lessons from them in the UK and to refuse to allow that awful appearance that there is only one homogenous Jewish voice and it's represented by people well to their right. I think that development is happening, and the lesson to take from it, from those American groups where they've been successful, is that they are positive and dynamic and open. They are interested in putting forward the most beautiful and noble of our traditions of solidarity and struggle. And I think that is a lesson in optimism that we can often take from our American comrades.
Thank you very much, Barnaby. Do either of the other of you, David, do you want to come in?
Yeah. I mean, agree very much with what Barnaby said. I visited the US twice in the 1980s. I was in New York City, and when I was there, I saw lots of similarities. Particularly, you know, the older people I met there reminded me of the older communists and Bundists I'd met sort of in London as well, and the kind of, you know, the sort of lot of values in common. But something that has really struck me about the differences is how decentralized the Jewish community is in America. You've got various bodies that would like to be very powerful, but it's a much more pluralist situation in the Jewish community there. Here, we've got a very tight Jewish conservative establishment that is given far too much respect and far too much status, particularly by the pro-Tory media here. It really suits them to see the Board of Deputies, Jewish Leadership Council, Community Security Trust, and that Tory pro-settler chief rabbi of ours as if they're kind of neutral people who are rightly in place to lead the community, and they're really not. You know, and I think in a way, the American situation, the Jewish left there don't suffer so much from that as we do here. But what also seems a similarity today is that it seems that both in the US and here, and Barnaby can correct me if I'm wrong on this, The growing elements in the Jewish community are the further left and the further right, and it's the middle that is kind of collapsing or feels very embarrassed and, you know, can't really assert itself. And to me, you know, the growth of the far right in the Jewish community here and there really worries me, but I'm also very encouraged, particularly since 2000, the growth in sort of Jewish leftist and radical organizations. We've also, in our magazine Jewish Socialists, been really pleased to get writing from people in America, and I think we're going to be expanding that.
Thanks, David. Naomi, did you want to say something?
I think I'll pass on that one because we had some wise words, and it would be good to get in some more questions. So
okay,
that's fine.
Okay, I've got a whole list of questions. It's really hard to decide. Here's one which will kind of be relevant to our very big audience today. How do the panel feel about non-Jewish people deciding, as in the Labour Party, who is the right type of Jew and who is not? I know, Naomi, I've heard you speak about this.
Yes, my goodness. This is one of the most horrendous features of what's been going on in the Labour Party. I mean, it's bad enough that certain kinds of Jewish representative set themselves up as being the arbiters of what is and what is not Jewish identity. And that's one reason we're all here tonight, is because we represent traditions and a body of ideas and action which is simply not given a voice. But of course, when you look at the people who were pushing the wave of anti-Semitism allegations against Jeremy and his allies, so many of them were not Jewish. And, you know, there's a whole sort of rogues gallery, Ian Austin and John Mann and Chukwu Amuna and what's the one who was who had Joan Ryan, who actually headed Labour Friends of Israel. We can go on listing them. In my own party, I know that a lot of the people who ganged up on myself and the chair of our constituency and contacted the Jewish Chronicle to denounce us are not Jewish and have no interest in this, all the issues that concern us. And of course, Luke Akehurst, for heaven's sake, this man who is not Jewish, who runs an organization called We Believe in Israel, which I think is him and one other person, David might know more, is campaigning actively against Palestine solidarity activism, to the extent that he circulated to his very extensive mailing list letters saying that on the day that the Palestine Solidarity Campaign had its national lobby of Parliament last week, a virtual lobby, they should tell their MPs to ignore the lies of Palestine Solidarity, because this is just an anti-Semitic organisation which should not be listened to. So it's horrendous, and it does seem to be one level on which it might be worth looking back to America again, is the idea that you can shut down discussion because you define a certain set of people in a certain way. That, Barnaby, maybe confirm this, I don't know, that seems to be harder to take hold in the States because of is it the First Amendment? Sorry, my constitutional understanding of the States. But here it's just become axiomatic that if a Jew says that they are offended, then that discussion must end or not even be put on the table in the first place. That's the situation we're in now in the Labour Party, where alleged offence by a certain section of the Jewish population is taken by political arbiters of a certain perspective in the Labour Party as justification for not having that discussion and suspending or otherwise disciplining people in the party. It's really frightening.
Thank you very much, Naomi. Welcome back, Andrew. We're glad to have you back. I can see that David wants to say something on this. You're muted at the moment, David.
Yeah, unless Andrew wants to...
Andrew, did you hear the question?
About non-Jews accusing other Jews of various things. I mean, it's not for me even a matter of, you know, whether they're non-Jews or Jews. It's simply about the reality that who has this right to decide who is an acceptable Jew or not, especially on the basis that this is purely about politics, as all of the speakers have indicated, as Naomi's indicated in her response. You know, you're basically a non-Jew, I mean, in some terms, a non-person, if you have views of the left. And what is most terrifying about this is this is a view that seems to have taken hold amongst the most senior leadership of the Labour Party. And the ultimate irony, of course, being that probably the vast majority of people being suspended and threatened with suspension in the Labour Party are themselves Jewish. And I think if anything gives credence to the fact that this is simply a reactionary political campaign to try and stop criticism of Israel and try and stop support for the struggle of the Palestinian people, it is that, in my opinion.
Thank you very much, Andrew. And I think, David, you wanted to say something, and then I'm going to hand back the chair of this section to Andrew, if that's okay. Just maybe have one or two more questions. But David,
quick things. I mean, I don't watch that much TV, but there was a period a few weeks ago where every time I turn on the telly, there was a non-Jewish person telling me how I feel as a Jew in the Labour Party, and they got it wrong every time. You know, and I was thinking, don't tell us how we feel, ask us. And I'd like them to come particularly ask Jews in my branch of the Labour Party. I'm in Islington North. We're the people that have actually see Jeremy week in, week out, and get to know him. You know, and actually, if there was any truth at all that Jeremy was in any way anti-Semitic, I think us Jews in that branch would have noticed. And in fact, 25 Jewish members of Islington North wrote a couple of letters in the last few weeks to the press, where we supported Jeremy personally, and also supported his statements on the EHRC report, which we thought were perfectly honest and reasonable statements. I do find it in a way a type of anti-Semitism that stereotypes Jews as if they have just one view, and I think that's a very well, it's nasty and it's dangerous.
Can I just add one point on that?
Yeah, Barnaby.
One of the reasons that this is that it is so dangerous right now to treat anti-Semitism as a kind of cheap factional tool is precisely because this is actually a moment of rising anti-Semitism. You know, if it were the case that Jews were all fine, and sometimes Jews on the left have risked sort of in being very defensive about allegations of anti-Semitism, giving the impression that really Jews are just fine and it's all just, if it really were the case that Jews were all fine, then maybe this would just be irritating, this attempt to pretend that Jeremy Corbyn is an anti-Semite or the left is institutionally anti-Semitic. But given that all the evidence is that anti-Semitism is on the rise, there's a particular danger, which is that I think we've all encountered, that people turn around and say, there's a campaign against anti-Semitism that seems unreasonable. It's getting lots of media attention while other forms of racism in Britain go apparently uncared about by the same political establishment who claim to be anti-racist when it comes to Jews. What must the answer be? And some people say, well, it must be, and they whisper it or they think it or they say it aloud, well, it must be a very powerful Jewish lobby. And that's why I actually think it's so important what Naomi has said tonight and what Andrew said and what David said, the centrality of lots of people who are not Jewish to this, because I don't read the Board of Deputies as the authors of this campaign. I think they're a convenient plaything for people who have quite other agendas, who want to destroy the left, who don't really care about Jews, and who will stop pretending to care about Jews when it's no longer politically convenient for them to. And that's why the Jewish left can give a very, very strong response to the anti-Semitism, which is present and is increasing partly as a response to this this crisis. If you look at the anti-Semitism in the Labour Party, some of it is lots of it is people saying, why all these attacks on Jeremy Corbyn, who seems like a nice guy? Well, it must be, you know, some Rothschild conspiracy or something. And the Jewish left can say, no, it's not that, actually. That's an anti-Semitic conclusion. And the truth is that there are quite other agendas at play. People who care about defending the state of Israel because they're racist and imperialist and not because they're Jews or care about Jews. And people who are opposed to the class politics of Jeremy Corbyn for quite other reasons. And they're willing to use Jews for their campaign, but it's not a panic created by powerful Jews. And it's not really evidence that Jews are very powerful in Britain and control the media. It's evidence that the media and the right is willing to use Jews for their agendas.
Could I pop back in just for a second? Because I agree very much with what Barnaby's just said. An indication of how dangerous this mischaracterization of what anti-Semitism is and how to fight it is that people think that there are a lot more Jews than there really are. Have you come across this? I was talking to some people in my Labour Party recently, and I said, just out of interest, well, how many Jews do you think there are in this country? And we had a chat about the overall population because they weren't quite sure, 67 million or so. And one of them actually said she thought there were 12 million Jews in this country. And when you know that number is well below 500,000, 300,000, some say even less, that is frightening. I mean, that people have this impression of these people who are everywhere, controlling everything. It's really scary. Rob Ferguson says 12 million, I wish. Yes, yes, Rob.
I think it would be great if there were 12 million Jews in Britain. I'm not sure I'd be frightened by that, but maybe they mean it.
No, I mean, it's frightening that people think it when it's not true, you know what I mean? It's bizarre. Anyway.
Thanks very much, Naomi. I'm going to hand back the chair of this discussion to Andrew, if that's okay, and I will sit back and watch it because I'm not part of it.
Julia, don't go anywhere, just in case I have another internet problem. I even went so far as to pay money for what this hotel calls their ultimate Wi-Fi, but it did me no good at all. So be warned. Two quick questions of the panel, and I'll ask you to be as succinct as possible. I think we've started to get onto this question and some of the answers to the last question. But let me ask more specifically. Let's talk a little bit about the relationship of British Jews to Israel and Palestine.
Mm-hmm.
And I'd be very interested to hear all of your comments on that. And Barnaby, feel free to do so, even though you are at a physical distance at this point. I comment on South African politics from wherever I am in the world. Naomi, would you like to have the first go at that?
So you're talking about the perception that Jewish people have of their own relationship with Israel thing. It's an interesting one, isn't it? Because I get the impression, I think this is something that we've seen in the States as well, that the more the community has, sorry, I'm doing that, the community thing, the more the various elements of the Jewish community loses its faith and worries about marrying out and losing an identity as a religious group, Zionism and a connection with Israel has become kind of more important. I don't know, maybe that's not true now as it was a couple of years ago, but it was definitely a feature. You had this impression of people desperately clinging to an identity and making Zionism the thing. So I said in my little speech earlier that I spent a lot of my time patiently explaining to people that being Jewish doesn't entail adherence to Zionism or loyalty towards the state of Israel in everything it does. But now we're told that it does, actually. I mean, we've been told over the last couple of years by the former chief rabbi, by the current chief rabbi, by the Board of Deputies over and over again, that to be Jewish is to be a Zionist. And this is very dangerous. I mean, in terms of the Jewish, see, unfortunately, I live in this left Jewish bubble. So everybody I speak to finds that assertion utterly absurd and ridiculous and dangerous. So others who are closer to the more mainstream Jewish community may be better informed about this than I am.
David, any thoughts? You're mute, David. You need to unmute yourself.
I think a key moment was 1982, the war in Lebanon, because I think you can start to see a decline in enthusiasm for Zionism among large sections of the Jewish community. Not that they still had a kind of knee-jerk, if somebody attacks Israel, they'll want to defend it, but any kind of moral argument for Zionism or the kind of, actual enthusiasm for it, I think started to decline. And that's been reflected in some important surveys in the last 15 years or so. About 15 years ago, when there was a major survey asking a big sample of Jews how they would define themselves, it was more than 70% defined themselves as Zionist. 5 years later, when the same question was put, and this was in a survey carried out by a left of centre pro-Zionist organization, they found that it dropped to 59%. So, but that can still happen while at the fringes things are sort of, you know, the right is becoming further right and the left is becoming further left. But I'd say another factor of it is that the number of children that Jewish children go to Jewish schools. I was a minority in the 1960s going to a Jewish primary school in Hackney. A lot of the affiliated community send their children to Jewish schools, and they're fed a lot of pro-Israel stuff in those schools, but they're having to sort of keep feeding it and feeding it to make it in any way convincing. So I'm an optimist about the longer term on this. I think we will see that decline of support and interest in Israel and Zionism. And I think it's reflected also in the States. I understand that in the under 35s in the States, there's kind of similar trends.
Barnaby?
Yes, I think there's clearly a generational split. I mean, if you go to, when I go to synagogues in New York now, they're flooded with AIPAC materials or pro-Israel stuff, which is mainly there because to sort of push at the young people because they fear they're losing the young people. I think this is a very important question that you ask, Andrew, that lots of non-Jews, to be honest, often don't understand very well, which is what Israel means to Jews. And I think it's very important to, and not all Jews, but to lots, especially people of older generations who remember the Holocaust or whose parents remember the Holocaust. And I say this because I think it's very important for people to understand the narratives, even of those with whom they disagree. And understanding a narrative doesn't mean you then have to say it's right, or that because it's a narrative, it's valid and has some truth to it. But of course, it's the case that a very, very particular reading of Jewish persecution, the Zionist reading, which said this is a kind of eternal law of human civilization, that Jews will always be marginalized, and there's no hope of building cosmopolitan societies in which we can all be free. That reading was, of course, given an enormous boost by the Holocaust, not only because the Bundist communities that David was talking about were materially annihilated, the secular Yiddish-speaking world was simply destroyed by the Holocaust, of course, but also because the very idea, the hope of building a better socialist society in which everyone could be free in Poland seemed to take the most enormous battering after you've seen in Poland the gas chamber and many Polish people cheering it on. So it's important for people to understand that support for Israel comes out of a deep and widely shared trauma. I think it's only one reaction to trauma, only one response to trauma, and of course the other is to say this was a horrific experience, it must never be allowed to happen to anyone. And not just this, not just the Holocaust must never be allowed to happen to anyone, but any kind of injustice and persecution must never be allowed to happen, must never be meted out to anyone. But I think it's very important to understand the roots of those fears and to take them seriously and sensitively. And I think the possibility of doing that has been written out partly by a trend in our contemporary politics, in anti-racism more generally, which is the stress on the kind of inviolability of something called lived experience, where if someone experiences something, then you must simply bow before it. And this is a general trend which forgets that, of course, experience is always processed through something called ideology, and that we should be able to take experience seriously and think about it and treat it sensitively and kindly and generously, while also being aware that it may be misleading in all kinds of ways. And I think we have to recover those traditions so that our fight against anti-Semitism isn't just a poll, what do Jews think and how do Jews feel? And it's not just us saying, well, you're right-wing Jews, but we're left-wing Jews and we feel this, so listen to us as left-wing Jews. Actually, there's a deeper principle at stake here, which is that the fight against racism isn't just about protecting particular communities. It's not just about being what in contemporary politics is called an ally. I stand with you sort of passively and support you in your fight. It's something much more beautiful than allyship, which is called solidarity, which is I recognize that you being targeted also targets me, because these various forms of discrimination are all about shoring up an unequal and oppressive world, and we want to get rid of all of them. And so that kind of politics, I think, means that you can understand how traumatic memories forge themselves into oppressive kinds of politics without, and you can treat it sensitively without needing to either deny that that happens or to say, well, because you believe this, you must be right.
Absolutely. I think that's absolutely crucial. I think the four of us could probably spend at least another 2 hours discussing just this question, but we have some great music to come, so we're not going to take up any more time. I want to ask you one final thing, and I'm afraid all you can do is give the name. Tell us about that means one, Jewish radical who has inspired you.
I want to go first because I'm afraid someone else will grab my selection.
No, me.
It's got to be Marek Edelman, leader of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, co-leader, and the author of that inspiring quote that we keep on referring to, always with the oppressed, never with the oppressor. Fantastic story and amazing.
David? You need to unmute.
Yeah, although I talked a lot about the Bund, I'm going to mention a Jewish communist called Charlie Goodman, who grew up in the East End of London, and he was arrested at the Battle of Cable Street, and he served 3 months in prison. And when he was in prison, he was desperate to carry on the fight against fascism. And as soon as he was out of prison, within weeks, he was over in Spain fighting as part of the International Brigade. He came back wounded from Spain. He joined the army in 1939 for the Second World War, and he's told me his first piece of action was punching his officer in the face who had made an anti-Semitic remark. He stayed in the East End the rest of his life. He was very active in housing campaigns and was a brilliant anti-racist activist and a communist and socialist activist for the rest of his life. Great, inspiring person. And I was lucky enough to speak on platforms with him a few times.
Barnaby.
It's an impossible question. So I'm just going to do the cheap move that no one else has done, but it's important that I make this intervention. Of course, the greatest Jewish radical of all is Karl Marx, and he truly belongs in the pantheon of the great prophets of what is sometimes misleadingly called the Old Testament and should be called the Bible. He understood the need for universal emancipation and the need for dedicated militants of the revolution to bring it about. And I think that's a very Jewish thing. Not to say that's the only Jewish tradition. I've never but I think it's one of many Jewish traditions.
Wonderful. It is an impossible question.
Who's yours?
Oh, Andrew, yes, yours.
Somebody I never met but would have liked to, Ruth First, because of her extraordinary courage. She taught sociology at Durham for 10 years. And I come across so many people who were lucky enough to have been in her classes. And they all say to me that she was the most inspiring teacher, mentor that they had ever come across. But because I didn't meet her, I'm going to put it in the context of one of the first times I met Joe Slovo. And bearing in mind that Joe was almost 40 years older than me, I met him at a gym in Johannesburg before we were in government, when we were preparing for the first democratic election. He was on a bicycle next to me and going a hell of a lot faster than me. But what was most striking was that he had very bright red socks on. And I made some sort of comment about his socks. And he just looked at me and he said, "You don't know that even in bed, I only wear red socks to remind myself of why I get up every morning to fight for justice, equality, and freedom."
Wow.
And then he said to me, "And young man, our voice will never be silenced." And what we've heard from this panel is from David, the history of Jewish radicalism, from all of us, I would hope, the present of Jewish radicalism. From Barnaby, he represents something of the future of Jewish radicalism.
Yeah.
But the one thing we can and will say definitively, there will always be Jewish radicalism, and it will always be very noisy.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Andrew, for coming back in. It was really brilliant to have you, and to all of the panelists. Really, really inspiring to listen to all of you. And we're at the final participant in this amazing event, and that's Phil Tomlinson, who is a musician. He doesn't come from a Jewish background, but through his wife, who was brought up in an Orthodox Jewish family, has become increasingly involved with Yiddish music and language. He plays in a klezmer band, and he sings and he teaches Yiddish songs, and his band Yovel currently has a performance called Yiddish Revolutionaries, which introduces the history of the Jewish left in the West through Yiddish song, readings and klezmer music. He is a founder member of the team that runs the successful annual Kles North Weekend Festival in Derbyshire, not the heart of the Jewish community. So wonderful that so many people go to that and learn and are creative together. You can find out more about all of this, and please do follow it up at philtomlinson.co.uk. And I'm going to hand over to you, Phil. Lovely to have you here.
Thank you, Julia. That's lovely. It's a real honour and a pleasure to join this wonderful gathering to celebrate Jewish radicalism. I've been asked to sing a couple of songs in Yiddish as a suitable conclusion. As Julia mentioned, Yiddish was the main language of the Northern European Jewish population in the 19th century. It's written in Hebrew letters from right to left, but is essentially a Germanic language, so some of you will be able to follow some of it. Yiddish reached its peak in the early 20th century and was sadly almost wiped out in the Holocaust. I've very much fallen in love with the language through Yiddish songs and continue to learn. Today, I'll sing you a couple of songs from our show, Yiddish Revolutionaries. But first, a little context, and my apologies to those of you who know more about this.
Sorry, Phil, could you turn up a bit? You're a bit quiet. Is it possible you can turn it up?
Let's see what we can do. It's all auto, isn't it, on these things? So let's audio settings. See how that works. Oh, if I take off, sorry about this, folks. I'll just take off auto and see what that does, and push it up to the top.
Yeah, that's better. Thank you.
Better?
I
hope when I sing, your ears don't burst. We'll be fine. Okay, so. Firstly, just to remember that the Russian Empire at the end of the 19th century included Lithuania, Latvia, Belarus, Ukraine, and much of modern Poland. It was a huge area. Much was changing politically and economically at that time. There was great poverty and movement of people, and the Jewish people also had to survive restrictive laws and periodic and often lethal pogroms. So, if you were Jewish, what were your choices? As David Rosenberg has already mentioned, there are a range of options. Some sought refuge in assimilation, others in religion, some left for other lands, further west or Palestine, and for others it was political struggle. And as you might expect, there were several and changing options here. The best known of these was the Bund, or to give its full name, the General Jewish Labour Bund in Lithuania, Poland and Russia. The Bund was formed in 1897 and by 1906 was the largest socialist group in the Russian Empire. Its belief was that the Jewish workers should organise to join the rest of the proletariat in a new secular, integrated socialist state, very much about socialism where you live. Bundist groups spread widely internationally and became particularly focused on supporting Yiddish language and culture, as Yiddish was the language of the working people. This focus on Yiddish secular culture remains identifiably active today. Now, my first song was written in 1901 by Ansky, a Jewish writer, ethnographer, poet and radical. This song, in Salzig Yam, together with Die Schwur, the Oath, are the best known anthems of the Bund. This song takes us from the depths of despair to a certainty that the workers will be the heroes. The translation should appear from time to time on your screens, and I'm happy to leave that to somebody else. And in Salzig Yam. In salzigen Jam von die menschlichen Tränen gefindt sich a schrecklicher Traum, gefindt sich a schrecklicher Traum. Kennt schon die Tiefe, nicht finstere Wellen, im Segen der blutige Strom. Kennt schon die Tiefe, nicht finstere Wellen, im Segen der blutige Strom. Dem Traum haben tausende Jahre gegraben, Monen Sinne und Pein, Monen Sinne und Pein, und tausende Jahre als Tropfen nach Tropfen, es gießen sich Tränen rein, und tausende Jahre als Tropfen nach Tropfen, es gießen sich Tränen rein. Dem Arbeiter wird endlich der Lesen von Hunger ewiger Leid, von Hunger ewiger Leid. Und wer wird dem Weg ihm zur Freiheit beweisen, zur Brüderschaft, Gleichheit und Freiheit? Und wer wird dem Weg ihm zur Freiheit beweisen? Zur Brüderschaft, Gleichheit und Freiheit. Der Arbeiter wird die Welt befreien, heilen. Wird der Gleichen den Tombisen Grund, wird der Gleichen den Tombisen Grund. So leben von Russland, von Litauen und Polen, der jüdische Arbeiterbund. So leben von Russland, von Litauen und Polen, der jüdische Arbeiterbund. Okay, I've got one more song for you, and I'd like to finish with a song that needs very little. Okay. Known across the world in many languages, this Yiddish version is the work of Ansky again. As I sing in Yiddish, Zoom gives the great advantage that you can listen or sing along as you wish in any language you wish. The Yiddish will be shown in transliteration. If you haven't guessed already, the song is Der International.
Oh.
So this Yiddish version was actually written about 1900, which is not that long after the original, and it's been around a while, and it still works fine. Steht heut, wir alle werden schlafen, in Hunger leben muss in Not. Der Geist, der Koch, der ruft zum Waffen, in Schlacht, wenn Firmen ist, greit. Die Welt von Gewalttaten und Leiden zerscheren wir an mir und dann. von Freiheit, Gleichheit, Taganeten, was schaffen wird der Arbeitsmann. Das wird sein schon der letzte unentschiedene Streit mit der International steht auf der Arbeitsleid. Das wird sein schon der letzte unentschiedene Streit mit der International steht euch für Arbeitsleid. Once more. Steht euch für alle, wer wird schlafen, in Hunger leben muss in Not. Der Geist, der kocht, der ruft vom Waffen, entsklavt uns Firren ist ergräht. Die Welt von Gewalt und Leiden zerstören wollen wir und dann von Freiheit, Gleichheit, Aganeten, was schaffen wird der Arbeitsmann. Das wird sein schon der letzte unentschiedene Streit mit der International steht auf ihr Arbeitsleid. Das wird sein schon der letzte unentschiedene Streit mit der International steht euch der Arbeitsleid. Dank.
Oh, follow that. Thank you.
Oh, amazing.
Well, did all go home inspired to take action after that?
Absolutely.
We never will. And thank you so much, Phil. Brilliant. And all that remains for me now is to thank all the speakers and performers, Alexi Sale, Barnaby Rain, Naomi Wimborne-Idrissi, Leon Rosselson, David Rosenberg, Andrew Feinstein, in absentia Irena Klepfish and Phil Tomlinson. And they've given us the benefit of their wisdom, their knowledge, their talent, and a precious treasury of Jewish radicalism. But behind all this has been an immense amount of hard work, and I've seen some of it. And the creativity and determination and the sheer effort that's gone into this by the young Red Labour team who have hosted this wonderful event and dreamed it up. I can't thank them enough. It's been a really, really brilliant evening. I'm just honoured to have been involved in it. And I know that we'll all go away inspired, strengthened, and more confident and more courageous as a result of it. So I'll just finish now and say good night, stay safe, happy Hanukkah or whatever you celebrate, have a good break, and don't forget, radical Jewish activism is where it's at.
Thank you for your wonderful
sharing.
sharing, Julia. Thank you. It's been great.
Thank you, Emily.
Thank you.
Thanks, Julia.
Thank you.
So much, everybody.
Thank you very much.
Well done, Julia.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks so much. Really.
Thank you.